I'm Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. And today I'm here with therapist Shannon Petrovich to discuss how to approach the hurdle of severing emotional ties with an abusive partner once you've made the decision to physically leave. So Shannon, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Steve. How about you?
I'm doing well. We got sunshine.
Nice.
It's always
We
good.
always have sunshine here in Arizona.
That is true. We don't always have it in Oregon, so this is good. So before we start today, can you just sort of tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe what brought you to doing the work you're doing?
Sure. So in college, initially, I think I wanted to be a doctor or veterinarian, but pretty early on, I realized that what really fascinated me was how we tick emotionally, psychologically, and relationally. So I ended up doing clinical social work and getting my clinical licenses. And I've been in the field about 35 years as a therapist in a lot of different areas. But about 5 years ago, I decided that sharing information and strategies that I've gathered over the years, just one person at a time, was not enough. And I started a YouTube channel called Therapist Talks. And that was interesting because I thought I would be kind of general mental health issues of all sorts. But what people really gravitated to and needed to hear was about toxic, abusive, and narcissistic relationships. So the more I focused on that, the more it blew up and the more I needed to focus on that. And then about a year and a half ago, I decided I really needed to bring it together into a book to help people to really heal when they've just realized that they're in a toxic relationship. And so my book, Out of the Fog into the Clear, Journaling to Help You Heal from Toxic Relationships, came into being last May. So I guess it's been a year now. And
Wow.
and it's just been a really interesting journey, trying to help people who find themselves lost in that fog.
This is a great topic for us to talk about because, as family law attorneys, we do a lot of obviously divorces that have a lot of physical abuse and emotional abuse, but emotional abuse is usually not as easy. I mean, physical abuse, there's more legal ramifications. There's more things you can do. There's more ways to prove it, for want of another word. But it can be kind of hard, can it, to identify emotional abuse and then be able to deal with it. How do you go about that? How do we go about even identifying what emotional abuse and a narcissistic relationship is?
It's really hard, Steve, and our culture doesn't really understand it very well. And the word narcissism gets thrown around and weaponized a lot. So we can talk about that as well. But how to identify it is really pretty simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. That if your thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs don't matter in the relationship and the other person's do, and you feel like you can't fully exist in that relationship and that you are relegated to having to placate, peace keep, and people please all the time, and that when you stop doing those three things, that the other person blows up or they implode or explode. Imploding meaning that they get suicidal and raging and tearful. Exploding, sort of that more conventional bullying tactics. But all of those things are basic ways of undermining you and making sure that your thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs don't matter. And if you feel like you're in that kind of a relationship, it's a toxic relationship because we as humans need to matter, and we need our primary relationship to be our most supportive area in our lives. And oftentimes that's the most hurtful and toxic area of our lives.
We had talked about some kind of specific ways and things people do to gain that emotional advantage. And I know you talked about a couple that I really thought were interesting, like, invalidating other people or distorting or dismissing them. how can people kind of see that? I mean, or, can you explain kind of what the maybe danger signs even are about those?
So one of the things that I really believe in and really start with in my individual work with people and also in my book is to recognize how you speak to yourself inside your own head. And so oftentimes we have a toxic relationship with ourselves. So we talk to ourselves somewhere along the lines of 40,000 times a day. That's a lot. And I don't know who sat down and counted all that, but apparently that's what everyone says. So if all of that is, I'm so stupid, I'm so ugly, I'm too fat, I'm too this, I'm too that, or whenever you get frustrated, you discourage yourself and I'm never any good, I'm not never gonna, I'm unlovable, those kinds of underlying toxic messages that we tell ourselves creates an environment where we can't defend ourselves against other people who would talk to us that way. So it isn't blaming the victim, and it isn't that it's your fault that someone treats you that way, but it is important to recognize those internal dialogues in order to stand up for yourself and start to be compassionate towards yourself and caring and encouraging like you would a friend. Typically, when you say those awful things to yourself, you don't talk to anyone else in your life that way. So recognizing that first is super key. And then recognizing how people speak to you and how they treat you. And that becomes a lot more clear once you've cleared up the inside. But sort of things like gaslighting can be tricky because they're trying to make you feel crazy. They tend to isolate you from your people so that you don't have people to reality check with. They tend to run down some of the most important things in your life so that you carve yourself off from those things and only focus on them and their things and their interests. Over time, you stop recognizing how you feel because you're so focused on how they feel. You start to only be involved in their moods, their emotions, their needs. And that's when you start to stop existing. And then there are some trickier ones like love bombing cycled with devaluing. And it's the cycling back and forth that really creates the hook that then hooks you into that trauma bond. So that the way that happens is by that love bombing. And people say, well, when you're first in love, it all feels like love bombing. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is if you step back and you take a breath and you want to go do something else one day and they freak out, that's love bombing. They were not genuinely wanting to get to know you and wanting to create real relationship. They were coming in hot and trying to grab control of you. One woman told me that she had a date show up with an engagement ring. I'm like, wow, that's coming in hot. So, that's hardcore love bombing. Doesn't even know her yet, but coming in hot, So we have to be really careful about that kind of thing. And when you take a break and you take a step back and you kind of observe the relationship, do they freak out? Do they get upset? And then do they kind of want you to placate them and their emotions? Then when they start to devalue you, you start to get hooked in.
It sounds like this is a cycle. Like it starts with, oh, great, great, great. Oh, terrible, terrible, terrible. Dead silence. Oh, great, great, great. I mean, it's a cycle that, you just sort of fall into, I'm imagining.
Right. And it's very tricky that way because when you're getting love bombed, that feels good. And then when the devaluing starts to happen, when they start to run you down or tell you they don't like it when you do that or say that, or you're not attending to them enough, or you're not being adoring enough of them, which is typically what it is, then they kind of punish you with anger, little bursts of anger, little pouty episodes, implosions and explosions. And when that happens, you sort of go, oh gosh, I want to get back to that love place. But the love place was never real to begin with. And so when you have that devaluing happening over in that cycling of that devaluing, you start to live on the breadcrumbs. You know, they'll throw you a little breadcrumb just as you're starting to get tired of it and want to bow out. And so then you get hooked in again and you think, well, I just need to behave better and I just need to do these things and don't do those things. And so over time, you're training yourself to do what they want and not do what they don't want. And pretty soon your thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs yourself do not exist in this relationship, and it's all about them. And once that happens, it's really hard to get out because you've ceased to exist for yourself and you don't even know what you think or feel anymore.
It sounds like a control. I mean, it's like the object is to control you. And once they control you, then like you said, you know, they can do whatever they want and you have to do what they want.
Right. And it's all about control and manipulation. And it's like a big smorgasbord of strategies. And so if this works, then they'll keep hitting that button. And when that stops working, they'll try other buttons. And so you have to learn to step back emotionally and watch the circus and not get involved in it.
Yeah. And that's got to be tough because these bonds, I was reading some stuff he said, yeah, are especially strong. I mean, they're stronger than you kind of would imagine they would be for, you know, being negative stuff. And so that leads to, you know, how does someone even start to break these bonds to get out of this relationship?
Right. And there is another key piece of that when you're getting into relationships, you have to be extremely careful with your heart. So there's some stuff called oxytocin in our brain, and it's the same chemical that's released when you breastfeed a baby. And it's released when you have sex with someone. So if you want to keep your head on board and not get sucked into a relationship too soon and lose yourself, you have to be careful with intimacy because you're bonding yourself to somebody at the level of breastfeeding a baby. That's pretty hardcore bonding. So you don't want to get involved with somebody before you know them really, really well. When I'm working with clients, I always say, unless you're ready to hand somebody your car keys, your bank account, and your PIN number, you should not be having sex with them. And people, they don't, you know, I mean, our culture stinks at this because people are sort of like 3 dates and you're in the sack. Yeah. That's a terrible setup for yourself. You are bonding yourself to somebody you don't even know.
Wow. Wow. The kind of getting out, working your way out, is that, if I were to come to you and with a situation like this saying, you know, this person is doing ABC, terrible, 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 I think, you know, I don't know what to do, how can I change them? Is that really the issue?
Typically, people want to diagnose their partner and then they want to change their partner. And so we clarify that right away. You're not going to change anybody. But sometimes the relationship has been set in motion in a way that's unhealthy, and both people want it to be different. So before you just bail, it's really important to start to take care of yourself. Like I said, emotionally being more compassionate and caring towards yourself, showing up fully with your thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs, and then watching what happens. So I've seen sometimes where a partner will start to stand up for themselves and start to say, no, that's not okay with me. And this is what I want to do. And this is how I feel about that. And the other person goes, oh, I had no idea because you never said. And it's like, cool, that's resolvable. But if, on the other hand, that person implodes, explodes, and really escalates their behavior because you're stepping outside that box they put you in, you know that that is a relationship that's not resolvable. So the first step is to emotionally step back and be able to watch the circus and be able to go, okay, that's manipulation, that's a lie. I know that's not true. And be able to do that. Sometimes you have to check in with your people, even if you've been separated from them for a while, and say, help me with reality here. Because my emotions are too sucked in and my higher cortex is just not online right now. And so when you get that higher cortex online, you line up the facts, then it's sort of like this war between your higher self, your wise mind, your smart mind, your rational mind, and the amygdala inside, that little fight, flight, or freeze that is emotionally attached. And you think you're in love, but that it's just an attachment. So in my book, I talk about clarity in terms of getting clear with your rational mind. And so the rational, and then you have to basically drag yourself through the process of getting free, because your emotional mind is going to go crazy when you try to separate.
Yeah. You also talk, I know, excuse me, about boundaries and creating them. And it's not necessarily just with that person. I mean, it's like sort of being able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not an easy thing if you're not used to doing that. And so, first of all, you have to recognize, what do I think and feel and want and need? And that's a hard journey in and of itself. For a lot of people, they focus so much externally that they don't even know those four things. So in my book, I do a lot of journal writing prompts so that you are encouraged to get in touch with who you are and what you're about and what you want and think and your character qualities. Because the other thing in our culture that stinks is that we think that we are what we look like, or our bank account, or our likes on Facebook, or what have you. Those things do not define us, but we think they do. So when you start to redefine yourself as your values and your character qualities, and you start to care about yourself, then you can stand up for yourself and your boundaries. When someone is abusive verbally or physically, then you're able to say, I'll talk to you later. I'm not going to put up with that anymore. I don't want to be treated that way anymore. I'm not going to listen to you when you talk to me that way. We can try again later. Again, sometimes people say, I'm sorry. I agree I was offensive and I won't talk to you that way anymore. Sometimes they escalate, and then you know that that person's not interested in you showing up fully in this relationship.
You mentioned earlier, I thought that was really interesting, about, well, even if you've been physically separated for a while and still talking about it. And that made me think, in our line of business, we get a lot of post-divorce, post-separation, co-parenting, or even not co-parenting issues that it's like they're divorced and they're physically separated, but they're not emotionally separated. So can you kind of talk a little bit about that, the physically separated versus emotionally separated thing going on?
Yeah, that is such a challenge. And in co-parenting or other issues, oftentimes you do have to stay in some type of relationship with that person. And so then it's really, really critical that you emotionally separate and emotionally distance yourself, and be able to watch the circus go by and not jump in the cage, so that you really know, okay, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. And all of that behavior is that person. And that is not about me. And I'm not going to get sucked into it. And I'm not going to react to it. All I need to do is, swap the kids out at McDonald's, and that's it. I don't want to engage in conversation, but we can, actually get good at taking care of ourselves, even within that relationship. Distantly, right? So learning to emotionally distance has to do with really all the rebuilding. And the last part of my book is all about rebuilding. We have to rebuild our sense of self. We have to rebuild our passions and our wants and our needs and our feelings. We have to rebuild our sense of what we want in our lives, our goals, our dreams. And all of that needs to be rebuilt. And sometimes we have to rebuild our whole tribe. Sometimes people lose all their people in a divorce situation because everybody lines up with that person who's super charismatic, and they leave you in the dust. And that's a terrible, terrible thing. But if you have a passion and volunteer for that passion, you're going to find other people who have that passion too. So there are lots and lots of ways to create a new tribe. And it's just important that you take the time to do that, because people who don't do the rebuilding process jump back into toxic relationships. And that's really tragic.
That leads to kind of that question. And like you said, it was kind of the last part of the book is that all sounds wonderful. And I'm in, and we're talking, I want to do that. How do I start? How do I start rebuilding myself or rebuilding others? I mean, how do I, what are some things I can do?
Right. And I think one of the most important projects of journaling that you do first is to write out the things that you do say inside your own head all day, every day. And then write out the truths about you. And sometimes people have a hard time with that and they have to consult their people, talk to your best friend or somebody who really loves you and knows you and say, what is it that you love about me? And so you can, again, from a values and character-based perspective, regain a sense of self. Well, I'm a really caring, compassionate person. I'm very loyal. I'm very dedicated. I am hardworking, so those character qualities are who you really are. And then these other things are lies. A lot of times they're lies that you learned in childhood, whether it's that, there was chaos at home or there were toxic relationships in childhood. Those lies don't come out of nowhere typically. And sometimes nobody said that to you directly. It's just how you felt. So you have to kind of write out the lies and then write out the truths and then start to superimpose and become your own best friend so that you're caring for yourself on a deeper level. And that gives you the ability to step back from somebody else's toxicity. And then you can watch it and notice it and not get drawn into it.
Is once you've kind of gotten there and it feels like I've figured out who I am, maybe, and I've at least been able to emotionally distance myself from people who I shouldn't be around. That's not the end, is it? Is this more of an ongoing process that, because you're going to probably jump into another relationship. Jump may not be the right word, but you know what I mean. And how do you make sure that you just don't fall back into that?
Yeah, it is very hard. And that was one of the things. My first job was in domestic violence, a domestic violence shelter. And it was tragic and shocking to me that a lot of the women that came out of an abusive situation, 6 months later were getting involved with somebody else and they were in the love bombing phase and going, no, this is different. And then tragically, a few months after that, they would show up again. So it's so critical. It's so critical that you do the rebuilding. And then the better you take care of yourself, the sharper your creepometer is. So we have, I did a video called How to Develop a Trustworthy Creepometer and the one thing that will set it off. But so we have to develop a good creepometer. And that is that we're taking such good care of ourselves that if somebody is off and says something that's rude or devaluing, or they even treat the wait staff in a really degrading way, because how we do one thing is how we do everything. And how we do one relationship is how we do all relationships. So a lot of people will say, if he doesn't treat my dog well, he's toast. And I agree with that. If somebody can be cruel to somebody, or their humor is all about being cruel to other people, your creepometer should go off and you should say, I'm going to step back here and just not be a part of this and not attach myself to this person. And again, you can play nicely in the sandbox if you have to, but you don't have to get attached to that person. You don't have to share your deepest, darkest, because they're not asking because they care. They're asking for ammunition to use against you later. So the healthier we get, the better we do at sussing out other people. And like I said, it takes time to get to know someone. And so don't get attached too quickly. Take your time.
We're almost out of time. We have run through time, but I do want to talk about because you talked a little bit about, being in physical abuse and emotional abuse, I mean, kind of the importance of getting out of it
Right.
is, can that kind of abusive relationship turn physical? I mean, is that something that, if you don't start to try to handle it, it can get much, much worse.
Absolutely. And one of the things that is true is that like I said, that big smorgasbord of manipulations, if these strategies work, then everybody's happy. If those stop working, then they might escalate to something more. And so typically things get more dangerous as a person separates. And that's why you want to make sure that as you're setting boundaries, maybe you start by doing that on the phone. I don't like the way you're talking to me. We can try again later. Bye. And hanging up. Now, if they escalate, you know that that's really a toxic relationship. So you can be in more danger when you try to leave. You have to be willing to call the police and get to safety and take care of yourself. It's really critical. But toxic relationships can actually make you so sick internally that I've known a lot of people who are suicidal in the space of that toxic relationship that's more emotionally toxic. And so when people are anxious and depressed and suicidal, oftentimes it's because somebody is emotionally beating them down constantly, and they feel like they've ceased to exist, and they kind of feel like, well, I might as well just end it. And so that is deadly as well. And like you said in the very beginning, the physical abuse is almost clearer to people. It's like, oh, well, if he hit me, I'd get out.
Yeah.
But that constant beating you down is so harmful that you're actually in as much danger in that situation.
I think that's incredibly important to understand. I really, really do. And going to maybe at the end here, a little lighter touch before we go. And before I'm going to ask you to let people know how to get a hold of you, is I love your creepometer thing. And so if we were to leave with one piece of advice, my kind of question to you would be, what is on everybody's creepometer? I mean, what is the one thing that if that's on it, get the heck out?
Oh boy, I don't think anybody's really very good at this, but I think if somebody is being cruel to anybody in your world, that should be a big indication, because oftentimes a person will say, well, you don't understand them like I do. They would never hurt me. I know they hurt that person or that person, but they would never hurt me. Your alarm bells should be going off in your own head. But if somebody around you says that, remind them that's not true. The way somebody does relationships is the way they do relationships.
I love what you said, if someone is being cruel to the waiter, they're going to be cruel to you.
Eventually.
Absolutely. So we're going to have to go. But before we go, please let people know how they can get a hold of you.
My landing page is nofoggydays.com or therapisttalks.com. And that will get you to my website, where there are tons of different things and resources of all sorts. So you'll see podcasts like this, and my book link, and the links to my YouTube channel, Therapist Talks.
I love it. Well, thank you, Shannon, for being so kind to come today to sit down to talk with us about really an important topic that doesn't get talked about a lot, because I think it gets bowled over by the physical abuse, and that's the emotional abuse, emotional ties, how to get away from those emotional ties, and then like you said, build yourself. So, thank you so much for talking about that today.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. If anyone has any further questions on today's topic, you can obviously contact Shannon as she had asked, or you can even post it here. We can get you connected with Shannon. And until next time, stay safe, stay happy, and be well.